the presentation in today's Saturday's program of Summer School. I'm very happy that we have with us a New York-based writing creator, Raicovich. I'll just read briefly a very short introduction to your presentation, and then I'll give the floor to you. In the presentation, Lara will discuss her tenure as the director of the Queen's Museum under the Trump administration and the experiences that led her to pen the most recent book, Cultural Strike, Art and Museums in the Age of Protest, published by Verso in 2021. She will address not only the circumstances that made the book necessary, but also what she learned from the process of researching and writing the book, which engaged dozens of artists, colleagues in the arts, and other thinkers about cultural space, power, and sites of culture. Lara Raicovich, as I said, is a New York-based writer and curator who lauded the book Cultural Strike, Art and Museums in the Age of Protest, was published in 2001. She recently served as Interim Director of the Lohman Museum of Art, was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at the Bellagio Center, was awarded the inaugural Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators at Hyperallergic, and is launching a new art initiative titled Protodispatch with Istanbul-based Protocinema in September this year. Thank you so much for being with us virtually. The floor is yours, Laura.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you here today. Oh good, can I see all of you? This is very disembodied and strange, so please forgive me if it's a little bit choppy. I usually have more interface with my compatriots when I give talks, so this is very nice. Thank you for having me. This is my book, Culture Strike. It's probably backwards. Maybe it's backwards for you. I don't know. But it came out last year. And what I thought I would do is read a bit from the introduction, because that kind of frames where I started before the reason I started to write this book. And then it's a brief reading, but I think it will frame the discussion well. And most of all, I want to talk with you all about ways that we can talk together about imagining our cultural spaces otherwise. So we are living in an age of protest. Around the globe, radical movements from prison and debt abolition to extinction rebellion, climate activism have penetrated mainstream discourse. Culture and art have necessarily also come under fire. While art has enormous potential to shift society, the institutions upon which it relies help hold systems of power in place. As much as I love museums and have dedicated my career to them, they are repositories of cultural hegemony, mirrors of society's ills, from enormous wealth gaps and other legacies of colonialism to the exclusion of historically marginalized groups. Museums and cultural spaces are part of the systems that protests hope to undo. I believe this undoing and redoing can not only make museums better for more people, but also map to ways to make change in society at large. And I guess I should also say that while this book is largely written from a US perspective, because of course that's where I am physically and where I work some of the time, there are obviously interrelationships with European models. My most recent experiences as the director of the Queen's Museum, by turns exhilarating, challenging to my core, and heartbreaking, are central to my thinking. I led the museum for 3 extraordinary years through moments that proved to be high points of my professional life and others that threatened to thwart my deeply held convictions of art and culture's vital engagement in societal change. A public museum, it is situated within a public park in one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse geographies on the planet. In a city of immigrants, Queens, host to New York City's 2 airports, is the place most newcomers arrive. Many stay in the string of neighborhoods along the number 7 train, the borough's spine, which transports a population that speaks over 138 different languages and dialects. Each subway stop opens doors into different cultures, and yet we're all New Yorkers. In awe of these realities, I took up my post at the Queens Museum in January 2015. Just 18 months later, the election of Donald Trump would dramatically shift the landscape in which I worked. While the museum remained on an upward trajectory of increased attention, support, and visibility, the results of the election deeply impacted the staff and our publics and collaborators surrounding the museum. Over a decade before I arrived at the Queens Museum, community organizers had been hired in a brilliant move to connect with nearby immigrant communities. Led initially by Jayshree Abhishandani and then by Prerna Reddy, this organizing effort created a new model for how museums could engage with their publics. The goal was not just to bring people to the museum, but rather to leverage its resources to surface and enact desires of these communities via cultural organizing. In the aftermath of the election on November 8th, 2016 in the US, the Trump administration's policies and rhetoric unleashed a Pandora's box of hate. And one of its primary targets, of course, was immigrants. At this museum, these new conditions were no mere abstraction, but an all too harsh reality. 5% of Queens Museum staff received deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA protections, which was President Obama's executive order that provided legal status to many people brought to the United States without documents as children. This group heard Donald Trump's promises to repeal DACA, without which they would risk losing temporary relief from legal uncertainty, or even face deportation to countries they had never even visited. Further, in the weeks following the election, many of the people with whom the museum staff had collaborated for more than a decade and a half through free family programs, the New New Yorkers art classes taught in over a dozen languages, gatherings and classes at Immigrant Movement International in Corona, Queens, and other long-term partnerships these people now feared leaving their homes and even sending their children to school. Whether or not the participants in these programs or others possessed documentation, there was worry of being caught up in a raid or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started getting Facebook alerts from various local groups spreading news of immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, being at one or another subway stop or heading to a particular neighborhood or intersection. Some even claimed that the alerts themselves were fake, sent out on social media to stir anxiety and fear. City council members planned special sessions to reassure their constituents, and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio convened a town hall in Corona, which is the town that the museum is in, or the area. The mayor convened a town hall with then council member Julissa Ferreras Copeland, along with a cadre of city agency heads and local uniformed police, to reassure immigrants that we were all New Yorkers, no matter our immigration status, and that local police forces and the educational system should be seen as allies. In this climate at the museum, we started holding weekly all-staff meetings. We contacted immigrant rights groups to be sure to stay updated on any changes in policy, whether local or federal, and shared this information with our networks. We coordinated with city agencies to be sure our staff and publics could access important information about their rights. We assembled a list of the museum's resources that could be lent to local groups. And we decided to join the art strike called for Inauguration Day. On January 20th, 2017, while the Queens Museum was closed to regular operations, the staff created a program that invited the public to work with a printmaking collective on creating posters, buttons, and other ephemera for the upcoming protests. Over 300 people gathered in the atrium that day. I was deeply moved by this gathering of retired school teachers, artists, students, and local moms and grandmas. Throughout the day, several in attendance thanked us for creating a space to gather on a day they felt so vulnerable. On that rainy day, it never would have crossed my mind that just over a year later, I would resign my post. What happened over the following 12 months would prove immensely complex. Several trustees did not like the fact that we were joining the inauguration day strike. Their position was that we should continue to do the work we had always done, but to do it quietly. At least one trustee expressed a fear of retribution from Trump via punitive tax audits of board members. From my perspective, not only had the political environment created a predicament in managing a staff with a significant number of increasingly precarious immigrants, I also felt strongly that we needed to be forthright and direct in our support for the communities with whom we had built a great deal over the years. Trust was at issue. The staff and I drafted a restatement of our values, which we felt would be an important buttress for our work. This took the form of a letter from the editor that we posted to the museum's website. I presented the values statement at the next board meeting, where it was unanimously approved. The statement, since removed, included the following. The Queen's Museum asserts a deep commitment to freedom of expression and intentionally supports and celebrates difference and multiplicity as fundamental to our collective liberation. We believe that art can shift the ways in which we experience our world, and therefore art, artists, and cultural institutions have a powerful role to play in society. The Queen's Museum, therefore, advocates for art as a tool of positive social change, critical thinking, discussion and debate, discovery and imagination, and to make visible multiple histories and realities. The Queen's Museum supports and initiates projects and programs that are inspired by actively listening to the needs and aspirations of the communities we serve and consider to be our valued partners. The Queen's Museum works to engender respect for a diversity of cultures, broaden access to ideas and art, and connect the public to opportunities for civic agency. And the museum uses our resources, human, financial, environmental, and beyond, to create greater equity, inclusiveness, and sustainability, both within our institution and in the broader society. Outside of the Queen's Museum, artists, art workers, curators, professors, and others started organizing with, as one Google group's name made clear, a sense of emergency. Around this time, New York's Museum of Modern Art installed an exhibition of art from their collection by artists who would no longer be welcome to the United States due to the Trump administration's so-called Muslim ban. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum submitted amicus briefs to the Supreme Court to overturn the ban, and which were co-signed by the Association of Art Museum Directors, the American Association of Museums, and more than 100 museums all over the United States. Smaller organizations were also doing whatever they could. From the sense of emergency cohort, a new working group formed, calling ourselves Art Space Sanctuary. The group was headed by Abu Farman, an artist and professor of anthropology at the New School, as well as a dedicated immigration rights activist. We looked to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s in Latin America, largely carried out by clergy members committed to liberation theology and using churches to shelter people fleeing violence, and the new sanctuary movement of the 2000s, spearheaded by an interfaith group of leaders in the United States seeking justice for migrants and immigrants. We thought that Art Space Sanctuary could communicate that cultural spaces were, in fact, for everyone, and that within these spaces there could be ways of conveying care and support. The Queen's Museum had a long history of collaboration with frontline organizations, including immigrant advocacy group Make the Road and addiction support group Drogadictos Anónimos, among others. The idea was to create a series of protocols that would allow museums and cultural spaces to make connections between audiences and the organizations so that we could support vulnerable populations. I strongly believed that the Queen's Museum would be an ideal organization to embrace this concept, given our long-term relationships and the extant programming at the museum. We hope to gather a critical mass of cultural groups that would become art space sanctuaries by agreeing to the guidelines Foreman had developed and made public on his website. This, we hoped, would signal the cultural sector's support for vulnerable people who worked in the museum as well as visited. The guidelines were flexible, and given that the Queen's Museum already had relationships with these frontline organizations, it made sense for us to sign on. Buoyed by the enthusiastic support of a few trustees, I presented it at our next board meeting. The response was profoundly disappointing. A handful of board members thought the idea completely untenable, expressing fears that the notion of cultural sanctuary would turn the museum into a place for people to hide out or sleep, a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept. With outspoken opposition to the initiative, it was impossible to move it forward. Moreover, the rhetoric of the rejection was grounded in the notion that as a public institution, we should not, and indeed could not, take sides in the political debates around immigration. We had, in their view, to repudiate a pro-immigrant initiative like Art Space Sanctuary in order to maintain a supposedly neutral position. It was demoralizing. The situation was further complicated in June 2017 when the Mission of Israel to the United Nations contacted the museum about renting the galleries to hold an anniversary event for the historic vote that paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The museum's physical building was an appealing location for the event because it was where the UN General Assembly actually met from 1946 to 1950, while prior to the museum's existence and while the UN buildings were being built in Manhattan. Their proposal was to reenact the vote that took place on November 27, 1947. Then Vice President Mike Pence was to be the keynote speaker, addressing hundreds of invited guests. I felt deeply uncomfortable with this space rental proposal. Typically, rentals of the museum were for corporate events or weddings or bar mitzvahs or other types of celebrations, and this was a very different kind of event. Not only was I gravely concerned about the operational impacts of an event of this scale, as well as its security implications, the mission's confirmation of the Vice President of the United States attendance more than 4 months in advance strongly suggested the political nature of the proposed event. With its government sponsorship and roster of politicians speaking and attending, I believe this was an event engineered to support the views of particular government aims, and that it violated what had been a long-standing practice of not renting the space for such events. Recognizing the unique character of this proposed rental, the matter was escalated to the board for consideration. I recommended against holding the event, but the decision was ultimately up to the trustees. After much debate, the board decided to decline the Mission of Israel's event. 2 days later, an article appeared in the Jerusalem Post stating that I was anti-Israel because I had edited a book about cultural resistance that contained a chapter about BDS, the movement inspired by Palestinian civil societies called to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. The article was highly critical of me for my supposed canceling of the event. A New York City Council member called for my dismissal and started seeking support for a petition, and the New York Post piled on with additional criticism. The board then reacted with great speed, reinstating the event it had days earlier rejected. No public statement corrected the misperception that the decision was mine. I found myself under an avalanche of hate for alleged anti-Semitism. In the aftermath of these articles, I felt I had to prove to board members, never mind the online universe, that was now propelling vitriol at me at a staggering speed, that I was indeed not an anti-Semite. My Jewish husband counseled me to talk publicly about his family's history, to relay that his grandparents were Auschwitz survivors, that our son had had a bris, and that my grandmother helped Jewish men escape across the border of fascist Italy during World War II. It felt horrible to trot out these facts about my existence in the effort to convince people who had known me for years that I did not hate people for their cultural or religious background. Meanwhile, the work of the Queen's Museum was garnering broader acknowledgement by the public. It was particularly encouraging when the New York Times profiled my work at the museum. We had just opened a new series of successful exhibitions, among them Never Built New York, which featured an array of architectural projects planned but never realized that made unique use of the panorama, a 10,000 square foot model of every single building in New York City's 5 boroughs that is the centerpiece of the museum's collection and was created for the 1964 World's Fair that was held also at the Queen's Museum before its existence. I was also deep into planning a major exhibition of artist Mel Chin's work that would fill the entire museum with major projects that would spill into various public sites throughout New York City. Additionally, we had recently received significant grants from prestigious foundations. With these promising fundraising results, we had achieved a financial milestone towards which I had been working since my first days at the museum. There was a lot to be proud of for everyone associated with the institution. Nonetheless, as fall unfurled and the mission of Israel's event took place at the museum, the politics of this event became very clear. At the November 28th event, Mike Pence delivered his speech as planned, which went far beyond a celebration of Israel's anniversary. It turned out to be a 45-minute policy speech previewing the Trump administration's intent to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump made his public announcement of the move from the White House just a week later, and in the days that followed, protests led to violence in Jerusalem and criticism of many US allies and the United Nations. Against precedents, the Queen's Museum building had been used as a backdrop for an announcement of a major shift in US foreign policy. And somewhat unbelievably, I still can't quite process that actually happened at the museum. As fall stretched into winter, I could tell that a small group of board members were unhappy with my leadership, particularly around my recommendations that we participate in the Art Space Sanctuary Initiative and decline the Mission of Israel's event. The job of the director of a museum in the US is difficult enough without this kind of doubt from the board. And after a grueling year end, I decided in late January 2018 to resign. It broke my heart to come to this conclusion because I knew I had so much more to contribute to the museum and its publics. There were a few board members who did not like that I was determined that the museum should take a position on events that deeply impacted our staff and the surrounding communities via our operations. I believed that as a cultural space reflecting our collective values, that we could not remain neutral, especially as the foundations of democracy seemed to be crumbling around us. Neutrality, in fact, is not neutral at all. Rather, to paraphrase the South African anti-apartheid leader Desmond Tutu, it is a position in and of itself that supports the status quo. And given how the museum had always operated, as well as its commitments to its own staff and collaborators, we knew the realities that confronted us could not be met with indifference. Since my departure from the Queen's Museum, I've been contemplating the history of how museums came to be in the United States and how they operate today, particularly in the ways their modes of storytelling embody a specific politics, and how we might understand their connection to a whole matrix of power relations and ideologies. Amid calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our spaces of culture, there's no way around a confrontation with neutrality as a persistent ideology within the museum. In a sense, it is the expertise of the museum that makes it trustworthy, that it selects art and makes exhibitions that are educational, that instruct its publics. However, there are many structures, from operations and governance to curatorial choices to the treatment of staff, that undergird these selections and the ways in which they are presented and interpreted by the museum, and that are directly oppositional to any desire for diversity and inclusion. The problem lies in the fact that these structures are unseen and unregistered, knowingly or not, and that they undeniably privilege those of specific class, race, educational, and social backgrounds. If we truly want to undo barriers to inclusion, we must face this false neutrality and dismantle it. So I'll stop reading there, but I'll say a few more words about the things that I kind of came to through the writing of this book. Clearly, this question of how neutrality manifests in cultural space was the starting point. This was the thing I was very curious about discussing, to understand whether or not neutrality was something we could identify within the museum space. And as I clearly felt going into the exploration, it was shown to me even more blatantly that, of course, neutrality is a myth, particularly within the museum space, given especially how museums were formulated. And so part of the book traces the history of the evolution of museums in the United States, largely coming out of collections of art and artifacts and books and objects that were collected by wealthy white men who were undoubtedly, collecting things they loved, things that appealed to them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they were collecting things that were appealing, that their personal taste decided was wonderful. And, many of those collections came to be public collections, or at least held by public-facing institutions when their children or descendants decided they didn't want to really deal with all of this stuff anymore, and so they were donated to their alma maters or schools or universities, and then became part of those universities' collections, and then became what was studied by several generations of students and scholars, and therefore became what was excellent. And so the relationship between what is excellent and what is just a person's taste or a class or a particular demographics taste of what's beautiful and wonderful, became the norm for what was perceived as excellence. And so, that's a very highly simplified version of my argument, but I sort of walk through that because I think it's important to kind of see. And of course, the system in the United States was based on proving this new nation or this new, colonial settlement, proving that it was just as good as its European forebears. And, and while those collections in Europe largely came out of, initially at least, came out of the church and royal collections, the shift was slightly different. The source was slightly different in the United States, but the same results. So the book then also traces discussions of several specific case studies of different conflicts that have emerged, controversies, conflicts that have emerged around cultural space in the United States over the last several years, to try and identify the kind of nut of those questions and issues, and give it a little bit of an analysis. And then finally, I finished this book in March 2020. That's when right before COVID really hit the United States, or before we knew it hit the United States. And over the course of the next 8 months, I wrote an additional chapter to the book, and then it came out last June. And I guess there are a few things that I want to say in relationship to what I learned from the making of the book, the writing of the book, and the research for it. And one of them is related to this concept of education that I talked about in the introduction a little bit, about the expertise of the museum and the trust that people have for it. And I think, there is a great desire for museums to share their knowledge, which isn't a bad thing, but at the same time, everyone who walks through the door of a cultural space comes with their own knowledges. And I think rather than constantly engaging in this broadcast mode of communication, if cultural spaces might rethink their engagement strategies to move to an exchange model or discursive model. And of course, many educational departments and museums have been doing this for a very long time. This isn't a new idea. But I think we need to reevaluate what spaces that's kind of employed within. And then, I think in terms of where the change can happen, within the structure of the museum or cultural space, oftentimes the unsexy part of change is kind of happening in human resources departments, in the spaces that control how we operate, not necessarily what we show or display or commission or whatever, but how we actually go about doing that work. And so I think that there is a potential for radical change within the kind of human resources department, which often in the US anyway, kind of controls the rules of operations to a large degree, especially around staffing. And then speaking to staffing and the way that the staff and publics have been protesting the museum, whether through unionization efforts. There's been a huge wave of unionization efforts in the United States around cultural space, and of course in many other zones as well. But for people who work within cultural institutions to really see protest as a form of radical care for the institution itself. Because of course, if people weren't protesting, they probably don't really care about what the institution is doing, right? So from my perspective, instead of the gut response, I think always is to say, well, no, we're not that bad. We're really trying here, but in point of fact, sometimes it's hard to hear the critiques, but these protests actually can be very useful, to understanding better how people are responding to whatever the work is that's being done or how it's being done. And then the final thing I'll say is that before we get into a broader discussion is that I think the only way to really make any change, within cultural space, which again, as I say, I think because museums track so closely in their inequities to what is mirrored in society, is a really interesting way of thinking about making change more broadly, is that we can't do this work of undoing and redoing without radically slowing down. There is no way to add the work of understanding how we might do things differently without slowing down, doing less or doing it on a slower pace in order to accommodate the additional strategic work, self-reflection, and collective work that we need to do. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can have a discussion.
Okay, we have some. Great. Thank you so much for sharing with us this I think quite unique experience that you had, and for the ability also to be captured in a book, so that it can further have influence. And this may be, I'll just start by making one question, and then I'll try to give the floor further for the discussion. How much did this struggle help other institutions and other museums and other work done in that context to rethink their positions and to try to formulate new possibilities for getting outside of this notion that neutrality is what the museum is about, and rather thinking what an autonomy should be for institutions that they occupy public sphere with resources and with everything else. Maybe just to start with this discussion, and then we can continue.
Yeah, I think that, what's hard about having this conversation, of course, is that the cultural field is extremely diverse, right? We have organizations that are very small and are doing incredibly inventive work and, really thinking through questions and problems in very activist ways. And then, there's a small organization in Brooklyn called Recess that is paying a minimum wage to every employee there. Anyone who starts working there makes a minimum of $80,000 a year, which is, a livable wage in New York. It's not, it sounds like a lot of money, but in fact, it's actually just fine. But you can live on that in New York. You don't have to eat lentils every day to survive. So there, and then there's the Met. That's a totally different beast because it's so enormous and it's sprawling, and it has a very patrician history and present, frankly. And will the Met ever adopt a radical ideology? No, but in its sum total, probably never. Their education department is doing incredible work through this program of public faculties, and so it's happening in niches within these much larger institutions that, of course, are much slower to make any change. But what's encouraging to me, and look, I'm, perhaps to my own detriment, an optimist, and as horrible as the world is at the moment, I feel like we're living through a particularly precarious and violent time. But I also see glimmers of hope. And I do think that there are people within institutions, perhaps not at the highest echelons of power, but there are people within institutions that care deeply about these questions. And one of the things that's been extremely heartening to me is that since the book came out, people have been in touch who I don't know, many from many smaller institutions, especially, who are so grateful to have a kind of a text that just lays it out, that lays out these problematics, that actually talks about them and the history of them, and that's really what I wanted to do, was to provide people who aren't in the museum field with a kind of something to think about, but also people who go to museums, something to think about what the positionality of the museum is vis-a-vis their own appreciation of what's inside those spaces, but also to give people who work within museums some tools to be able to talk and some language to be able to talk about the problems that they see. And so I feel like it's been I've definitely heard from folks that it's been helpful to them. Has there been wholesale change? Of course not. I mean, these things are iterative, and there will be many mistakes. But my biggest fear is that people don't do anything, and one of the things that has been disappointing to me is that there's a great deal of fear about making mistakes, of fear about feeling vulnerable, also about needing your job. In the US, of course, this is complicated by the fact that if you don't have a job, you don't have health insurance. So you kind of fall, not only do you not have income, but you cannot care for your body or anybody that's dependent upon you if you don't have a job. So this is like double disaster, and of course there's zero social safety nets. So this is part of the great precarity of the museum worker, of any worker in the United States. Hence the great thing about unionization efforts, which I do feel very hopeful about, because I think I grew up in a generation where of course, I greatly admired and followed the great radical tradition of unionization in the United States. But the contemporary unions I grew up with were not that admirable in their bureaucratic kind of fuddy-duddiness, with the exception probably of my mother's union, because she was a teacher. So she was part of the teachers union, which is a very powerful union in the United States. And, she still benefits as a 79-year-old pensioner from those union benefits. And truly, I do think the teachers union is a great example of how power can be built. But nonetheless, I digress. I think the unionization efforts are an extremely powerful way to create certain kinds of change that is very needed, extremely needed. And so I applaud those efforts because I think they're tough.
Let's open the floor for any thoughts, questions. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Just 2 points. It struck me in the circumstance that it was the trustees who made the real problem. So I just wanted to understand something about that structure, or
Yes.
How can one choose trustees one can work with? The second point is maybe a little provocative or stupid, but I'm just curious, what was it about the election of Trump that galvanized that response when all those organizations already existed because there was a need for self-protection, migrant protection? And so was it the sense that one understood a new quality of right-wing assault, Republican assault, or was it connected to a perception of a kind of Philistinism that is now in charge, and therefore the arts will suffer? And I suppose the addendum to that is, does it then stop under Biden, or what?
Right. Good questions, both. So the first question about so boards of trustees in the United States for the nonprofit, right? Because we're all nonprofit, we're private entities that receive tax. We don't pay any taxes because we are public charities, essentially. And so the museum, any nonprofit in the United States, relies on donations largely from private entities, whether they be foundations or individuals. Public funding in the United States, as you probably know, is minimal. The largest public funds probably come from local sources, whether they be local, state, or municipal sources. The federal government, I mean, in the United States, we don't even have a federal minister of culture. There is no national cultural policy in the United States. There never has been. The National Endowment for the Arts is a pathetic body, not because they're pathetic, but because it's never been empowered to do anything substantial. They do not set cultural policy for the United States. There is no cabinet level position that the president appoints to deal with culture at all. It's absent from any kind of national consideration. And therefore it also is absent from any kind of national funding. There is a paltry amount of money that gets distributed through the National Endowment for the Arts, but if I tell you the Queens Museum's annual budget was $25,000, it was $6.4 million a year, and we got $25,000 from the National Endowment for the Arts for one exhibition. I mean, it's insignificant, not that $25,000 is insignificant, but just in the grand scheme of things, that the federal government be contributing that small an amount of money to a significant New York institution is rather pathetic. So the problem is a balance of power, right? Because if you have private individuals who have, and those individuals are the people who serve as board members. Right. These are the philanthropists who are board members, are generally wealthy individuals who are contributing financially to the institution. That's kind of the classical model. And of course, that started as a way of providing some form of governance related control or check and balance on the organization to people who were making significant financial contributions, which I don't have a problem with. But I think that what is forgotten in the construction of the board member is this key word that is always brought up again and again, and that is fiduciary. That board members are fiduciaries, which comes from the Latin fiducia, trust, right? And fiducia means trust. It has nothing to do with money. But the way that board members interpret it is that it has to do with money, and that they are somehow a financial backstop to the institution's finances, rather than holding the public trust, right? Those are two very different things. And so I think there needs to be a kind of reconciliation of those. But I think on a bigger level, on a very practical level, everybody knows that if you have one funder, they're going to have outsized power. Oh, that funder will have outsized power over what you do and how you do it. And I think at the end of the day, the private funding in the United States has outsized power in the space of the museum because of the board structure. And so how do you diversify those sources of funds? And in the United States, the only way to do that is to have a significant contribution from the state. And I don't want to invert the problem and give the state all the power, because we know that that has its own issues, right? But at least if we could have a national conversation in the United States, which is impossible right now, I mean, it's totally impossible. A conversation right now about, what cultural funding, what is important about culture, and talk about it as a question of equity and cultural infrastructure. It's not about the federal government paying for exhibitions. It's about paying for the spaces to run, the heat, light, power, the health insurance, of the people who work in culture. This is about economic development. It's about, you can talk about cultural infrastructure as a way of achieving greater. This is not a conversation we can have in the current environment in the United States politically, but to my mind, it is one of the only ways that we will ever achieve a public counterbalance to the private wealth that is required to fuel cultural spaces in the United States at the moment. So that's in part to your first question. I mean, there's so much more to be said about boards and how they might be restructured, but I'll leave it at that for now. And then to the second part of your question, which I think is also really, really important. Sorry, my mind just went blank. Remind me of the second part of your question.
What was it about Trump?
Oh, Trump, yes. Well, I think it was actually a very practical thing, which was that I literally had people on my staff who were afraid they were getting deported and didn't know when. This was like, we faced the reality like this. It was like right here. It was not an abstraction anymore. This wasn't people in Washington making bad policy, it was not abstract. And because, of course, this anti-immigrant rhetoric was not new, but it was the president of the United States that was actually spouting it. It wasn't, this gave, when I say it opened a Pandora's box of hate, literally, I had friends who were like a friend of mine was on the subway one morning and a man spit on her and said, "Go back to where you came from." And she was like, "I come from Queens." And so like this vileness was allowed. It had never, I think in a way, having a president that actually espoused these values quite clearly and openly allowed any person that felt a scintilla of camaraderie or solidarity with that hate to be able to just enact it wherever they wanted because they were given permission. And this continues to be the problem through to today. I don't know, we can't put that genie back in the bottle. Like that is part of our reality going forward. Since Trump was elected, there is no undoing that will happen during the Biden's administration or the next one or the next one. This is a long-term problem that now it has manifested in the United States. And frankly, I don't know, I have no idea how we repair that, but it is a long-term project for sure. This is not something that can be, yes. And of course, the Queens Museum had long been collaborating with Make the Road, for example, the immigrant rights group, but that was a very unusual thing. I mean, other cultural institutions were not collaborating with frontline organizations. And so I think in a way, the election of Trump and the kind of rhetoric that he continues to espouse, has actually, made cultural institutions have to deal with the fear that their staff and actually the publics are feeling in some way. So this is happening at different registers. Like I said, MoMA did an exhibition of artists from their collection. This is like an incredibly beautiful gesture, but it was a safe gesture. These are works that were already in the collection, like these were beautiful, important. I'm not diminishing it, but it was not exactly, I don't know, like, wasn't exactly a radical move. And it wasn't going to accomplish anything concrete, right? Like, it was making a statement, but it wasn't actually doing anything. And so, I think in a way, I guess what I'm advocating for is also to allow different types of institutions to do different things on different levels. And the Queen's Museum was not and will never be MoMA. And so the Queen's Museum had to do things its way, and MoMA had to do things its way. And that's totally fine. I don't begrudge that. Not every institution needs to look the same, nor should it. But I do think that that the election of Trump really brought home, whether, as in the case of the Queen's Museum, where we saw, we had friends and colleagues who were not allowing their children out of the house, not going, if they were a two parent household, one of the parents always stayed home for fear of one of them being grabbed by ICE. This was like terrifying in those few weeks. After the election, and also leading into and after the inauguration. So, that the presentness of that and the reality of that I think, especially for those of us who live in states that are, more progressive, we never saw that kind of hate or that stuff really up close in that way. And, it was really quite upsetting and very real, very present.
I wanted to ask you about the idea of slowing down time. Because these social phenomena are not slowing down, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are progressing and gaining even more ground. How would you see any benefits? And we were talking about this. I think Bernard put forward, Bernard together with us, put forward also this discussion of time, understand that we have to present situations. And the other question may be in regards to the idea of unionization, creating unions. And,
the idea of what? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Creating unions,
unions, yeah.
Unionization of, let's say, institutions, workers, arts and culture, and similar. And I don't know if this idea was present before Trump, and if these institutions were ready for a situation like that to be able to confront the situation that arose. With Trump. And as you said, this level of faith was there already, but the levels were completely different. And how is the field now? Is it still so vulnerable as it was at that time? And internationally, were there any alliances supporting what you were trying to do? Whether there were
yes.
mechanisms, part of UNESCO, ICOM, CIMA or similar involved in the struggle at any point in time, or did it make any sense for them to exist?
Well, let me address the first question first, which was about sorry, what was the first question was, or maybe I should just do the second question about unions. Or do you want me to do the first question? I can do either one.
As you wish.
Okay, so the second question, I would say that unions, of course, have been around for a million years. Like this is not a new idea, and there had been attempts to unionize, for example, at MoMA, or but I think number one, I think that there was a certain complacency and way of thinking that said that people who worked in museums, we did it for the love of the material, and we were so lucky that we spent all day with the art. And there was this kind of rhetoric of family because people devoted so much time, with their colleagues, et cetera. And I think people really bought into that. And then, in these discussions of what labor is and like how this is actually work, people, like, it's not just, it's hard work. It's we should be paid a living wage. We should have health insurance that's appropriate. And we should have, we have demands. And I think that this came out of actually the attempt to diversify the kinds of people who worked in museums, because I think, as diversification happens, there were people who came from different social classes who were suddenly in majorities of the museum rather than being largely the children of very wealthy people who didn't necessarily need to have terribly good health insurance or have a particularly decent salary. And also many people didn't work in museums, frankly, just because they were paid nothing. They couldn't survive on those wages. And so they just went elsewhere. But I think that many people felt at a certain point that they wanted to be a part of the museum. And so they demanded a living wage. And so I think this evolution of the union has been really powerful. And of course, it's a larger social and societal and economic and social awakening that's taken place in the United States, as we see with the unionization attempts at Amazon and of Starbucks, and all of these local hyper local unionization efforts that are having a huge impact at this point, because they've been enormously inspirational. And so the tide has turned. It seemed for a very long time that unionization efforts would not be accepted, that people would be seen as radical, et cetera. And also, because the hierarchies within museums were also socially constructed, a lot of people were afraid to join the unionization efforts for fear of being targeted. And so it was very challenging for people. And I think the dam has broken a bit, and that, now it's not, while it may be seen by certain people to be, damning to be a part of a unionization effort, I think it's also a risk that many more people are willing to take. And remind me what the first part of the question was. I'm so sorry.
Well, this idea of we need to slow down time.
Oh, slow down. So what I mean about slowing down is to slow down cultural production, I guess, because I don't think that you can work at the same level in terms of producing culture and also changing the way that you do it, right? I think what I'm advocating for in the book is to say it's not just the culture we're producing in the world. It's not just the commissions that we make and the exhibitions we put on and the public programs we organize or whatever, but it's also how we do that work and who is making decisions, who is allocating funds, how are we hiring this person, how are we even going about seeking to hire an individual to fill a role, what credentials are we requiring? How do we imagine staffing a museum? Who is qualified to work in a museum in what post? All of these kinds of questions influence what decisions are later made at every single level. Whether, I'll give you an example. This is a very stupid example, but I think it's kind of useful. At one point, I was at the Queen's Museum when we were hiring a director of education. And, I'd seen the job description and whatever, and it had circulated, and we had gone through interviews, and we decided we wanted to offer the job to a particular individual. And we offered the position, and she came and she said, "I'm so sorry, I would love to take this job. I can't possibly take it because the salary is so low. I had no idea." And I turned to my after this conversation, I was totally confused. And I said to the head of human resources, I said, "I'm sorry, how did they not know what the salary was going to be until this point when we offered the position?" And she said, "Oh no, we never list the salary on the posting." And I said, "Oh my God, why? That's so stupid. We just wasted so much time. We wasted our time. We wasted this person's time. Now I'm in love with this person. I want them to come work for us. And there's no way they can come." and there's no way we can increase the salary. So it's like these incredibly stupid things stop us from, you know, understanding the bigger picture, right? So I said, well, we have to list salary rate, a range at least, so that somebody knows if they even want to apply. And this is like a very basic thing for creating and she was like, well, that's just not done. And I was like, well, we're just going to do it because it doesn't make any sense, right? And because that was kind of a norm, right? This is a norm within museum hiring, and which was clearly not benefiting anyone and actually working against equity. So in a way, we had to slow down and say, like, okay, maybe we should make some changes into how we make a posting. I mean, it's such a basic thing, a job listing. How many times a year do institutions put up job list postings, whether it's for an intern or a, you know, a position of great importance? And so let's slow down. Let's think about what we're doing and how we're doing it. Let's make sure that all different kinds of people are in the room when we're making important decisions, so that my blind spots might be made visible by somebody else's personal experience, right? Because we all have blind spots. I mean, you know, we can't all have every experience in the world. And so, you know, and that's why diversity is important, right? If you have more than one kind of person in the room, you're going to have more than one kind of opinion. So I don't mean slow. So I guess what I want to clarify is that I don't mean slowing down the work of undoing the problematic things that are here. But for that work to happen, we must slow down the other parts of the cultural production side.
Thank you. Do you have anything else to say? No, you're satisfied. Okay.
I'm glad you're satisfied.
Thank you very much for being with us, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you in December. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.